Welcome to Internal Controls for all governments, but with a twist. We're going to add a few things that are specific to small local governments because I know you guys struggle with that. A lot of my clients do. I'm Summer Sears. I'm a CPA. I'm based here in Bend, and I do contract work with local governments. I don't do any audits. I don't do any reviews. I have in the past, but right now I'm just a support and a partner for local governments, and most of them are small, like 10 staff members or less. And Kay Johnson is here to join me and help me.
Hi, I'm Kay Johnson. I currently work for the Sisters Camp Sherman Fire District. I've been doing accounting for about 35 years. I used to work for Fujimi America over in Wilsonville for about 10 years as their controller. And then I did consulting work for a lot of small businesses over the last 20 years. And then about 6 years ago, we moved to Sisters, and I found this job about 5 years ago. It's a part-time finance manager job, and then my husband and I own Sisters Meat and Smokehouse, and then I just do some small part-time work for other districts that are very, very small.
Good, thanks. Let's dive in with the definition of internal control. So internal control, a lot of us think that it's one specific activity that we're doing to try to catch fraud or to make sure that our books are accurate, but really internal control is the whole process. There are activities within that process, but the internal control is defined as a process. And it's trying to achieve certain objectives. Usually the three primaries are effective and efficient operations, which includes the risk of fraud. There's reliability of financial reporting, both to internal and external sources, and compliance with laws and regulations. Those are the three big things that I would assume all of you guys are going to want internal controls to cover. And the processes, the internal control processes, they interact not just with operations and your day-to-day transactions and daily business that you're performing, but also the financial reporting piece and making sure you're in compliance with laws and regulations and grants and everything else that you have to comply with. So just as a broad example, internal control process would be your entire disbursements process. So the purchasing side and going into the receiving of the goods and the invoicing and then cutting a check and getting approvals and reviewing expenses on the back end. That's the entire process. Feel free, you guys, to ask questions as we go along and also to chime in with other examples and suggestions as we go. We'll make this a group effort, drag you guys into it. So why are internal controls so important? It's all about accountability to our citizens, our grantors, our elected officials, and making sure that with the approved budget that it's been followed, the spending under contracts has been legal, that you're taking those safeguards against fraud. That's all about being accountable to our citizens and other people that have a stake in our local government. Grantors have given us funds for a reason. They want to make sure that we are spending money in accordance with that, and having internal controls allows us to ensure that it's spent the way it's supposed to be spent. It's also key for internal controls, not just from a fraud standpoint, but from an accuracy, reliability standpoint, to make sure that the data that you're providing to internal and external sources is reliable. Clear and accurate reporting, we just covered, again, internal and external sources. We've got the budgeting and planning purposes. If you don't have accurate, reliable financial information, it's really tough to create an accurate and reliable budget to work off of. Also cash flow management, same point. External sources, you've got your creditors, your bank holders and your bond holders, or your bankers. Granting agencies, again, and your financial statement users, your community. Just a few other points about the importance of internal controls. Efficient use of resources, that's an obvious. Eliminating redundancy in our processes. So reviewing internal controls and looking at the processes and activities that you have in place is a fantastic opportunity to create efficiencies in your organization. I know what you guys deal with. I know you're like up to here with workload, right? So anything that we can do to try to make your jobs more efficient, is going to take off a burden, it's going to make you more productive. We can do that with internal controls. We can look at it as a process. Maybe you have too many internal controls. That happens. And maybe we can modify that or trim it down and still get the same result. Protecting against loss, providing ability to recognize excellence. That is a great point where there is a standard. When you have internal controls, you're creating a standard and an expectation, and it's a way to measure against that standard and expectation. Building and maintaining public confidence. You guys know how important this is, right? And I have seen it too many times where there is not an appreciation for internal control. Either it doesn't exist or it's in place but not being monitored on the back end. And things go sideways and you lose confidence. You lose confidence from your board. Board members may lose confidence in staff. And the community may lose faith in your organization and confidence. And it just makes everything much more difficult. Yeah.
So, are your auditors considered part of your internal control structure?
They are not. Thank you, Rob Moody. Can I ask what jurisdiction you're from?
Marina Company.
From Marina Company, thank you. Yes. So Rob makes asks a good question. Internal controls exist within the organization. Your auditors are there to come out from the outside and look at that picture, look at your processes. They cannot be part of the internal control system that you have in place. They're coming to see what you're doing. So as you're going through a process, if you're looking at controls and you're thinking about, okay, well, this might go wrong in my organization, how are we going to find that? Oh, well, my auditor will find it. That's, auditors are not necessarily looking for fraud. That's not what their job is. And B, that is something that needs to be covered within the organization. You need to find another way. Other questions, thoughts at this point? Okay, so I want to offer you guys a couple tools. And the first one is SDIS Best Practices Survey. Okay, first acronym, I think. Bad habit right here of using acronyms. If I start using acronyms you guys haven't heard of, please call me out on it. Do, seriously. So SDIS, Small District Insurance Services. So Special Districts Insurance Services, thank you. So my understanding is every year they come out with a different best practices survey covering a different topic within governance that is meant to limit the district's exposure. And I think it was a couple years ago, but there was one that came out fairly recently that focused on internal controls. And I hope that some of you guys saw that, but it had best practices in it, along with some instructional videos that you could write, that you could watch, and this was for both management and the board. And my understanding is that if you accomplish everything on that checklist, you can actually get a pretty substantial discount on your insurance. So if you don't know that's out there, that's out there. On that best practices survey that was focused on internal controls, there were 4 components. There was a question: do you have a financial management policy? So what is a financial management policy? It's exactly what it sounds like. It's a document that lists all of your policies related to anything financial. It could be, here are the high-level policies for our disbursements process, for payroll, for our budgeting cycle, for the auditing cycle, for cash receipting. And it lists out the substantial, significant policies that the board will review and sign off on. And that's the guideline that the organization uses to make sure that its financial information is reliable. SDAO or SDIS, they have a sample policy. It's on their website. I do have it downloaded. If anyone wants to take a look at it after we're done with the session, we can do that. The next section of the best practices survey, it went into best practices, and it had a list of 13 items. Do you have this process in place? Do you have this other process in place? And you work your way through this list to see what you have, and if you don't have it, it's an opportunity to take a look at it and see if you can get it implemented. It also had some training videos that it wanted management and the board to view. It was 2 short YouTube videos about the importance of internal controls and what exactly internal controls are. And then it had a list. The fourth section of the survey was a list of different trainings, like the conference, certain sessions at the conference that SDIS would like the board and or management to attend. And if you can work your way through that list, then there's a discount. So I wanted to visit with you guys about the checklist and look at these 13 items and explain them maybe, or see if you have questions. Let's go through them. Maybe. There we go. Hopefully you guys can see that. I'm sorry the font is kind of small for those in the back. So item number 1, board authorizes all bank accounts and check signers. Pretty straightforward. A lot of times a board member, especially in small organizations, a board member is a check signer. So that should be part of your checklist for onboarding a new board member, new staff member, is getting that switched over and getting that approval through the board. Number 2 is the bank immediately notified of authorized check signers changing. It's part of that same process. Employees handling receivables, are they bonded? And I would, as a best practice, go a little further than that. Anyone who has a significant role in your financial processing, transaction processing, should be bonded. Or there is another option that I've been learning about, which is crime insurance. Speaking to our insurance agents and clients' insurance agents, they've been suggesting crime insurance as an alternative to bonding, suggesting that it's cheaper and it's better coverage for the organization. So throwing that out there. Yes? Bonded is like a surety bond. So you would go through an insurance agent to have someone bonded, and they go through, that individual goes through a process of signing a document, and then I think there's a background process. But once that person is bonded, it means if that person should perform some act of gross negligence or should commit fraud, then the district is covered for that person's actions. And that is number 4 on SDAO's list, was segregate those duties as much as you can. So if you're looking at a process, there's the initiation of the process, there's the actual performing, and then there's taking custody at the end. And to the extent you can switch people up and bring more people, at least 2 people, into that process, the better for the organization, and it's going to limit your risk. Number 5, transactions are authorized, supported by documentation, and recorded in the proper accounting period. I think that's pretty straightforward. Please have documentation for your transactions. It does happen where there are districts and transactions that checks that are cut with 0 documentation, so make sure you have that documentation. Checks are pre-numbered and used in sequence. Again, pretty straightforward, but kind of meaningless if you never check it on the back end. So if you have a sequence of checks a couple times a year, at least once a year, just run that out of your system. Some systems even have a missing check function, and see if there are checks missing. And if there are checks missing, try to figure out where they went. Where did they go? Yeah.
Also, we have a voided check,
Avoided check.
keep the check, and the card if you have
Keep the voided check with the support. And what jurisdiction are you from? Right. Good, thank you. STAO, SDIS is also wanting to know, do you have 2 signatures on all of your checks? 2 signatures required? And not just the signatures. I mean, the whole point of doing the 2 signatures is having someone else look at that check. So if you are the second signer, what that means is that you're taking on some responsibility, that check is reasonable, that it's legitimate, right? So when you're signing those checks, get the support, and do ask the question. If something just doesn't make sense, or it doesn't quite look right, it doesn't sit right in your gut, just ask the question. It's okay. And staff, if people are asking questions, if board members are asking questions, please try not to take it personally. They're just doing their job. They're just asking the question, and they're curious. So that's on us to try to not take it personally. Yeah, Eric.
And if you're a check signer, don't pre-sign
please don't pre-sign your checks. Do people do that? If you do, I don't want to know. Never mind, don't tell me. Bank accounts. Are you reconciling your bank accounts? And are you doing it timely? It's really important to do it timely. 2-3 months down the road, if something looks funky in your bank statement or reconciling your bank account, it's too late. Get to it within a couple weeks, if not a month. At least do it in the subsequent month and get it reviewed. Have someone else looking at it, again, just for reasonableness. Does everything make sense? Is your board receiving monthly financial reports? And are they looking at those reports? And are they understanding them? And are they asking questions? If you feel like you're providing financial reports and they're not even looking at them, I can picture two things happening. One, they either just have other priorities and they can't get to it, and they don't understand the importance of it, or they don't understand it and they get overwhelmed and they just tap out. So if you find that happening, offer some training and get suggestions from them about if a different format would make sense. Something like that. Have that conversation, because it really is crucial to have that back-end review from someone who's not involved in the process. That's your segregation of duties, folks, right? So that's the ideal, is that if you're submitting financial reports to someone, to your board, or anyone else for that matter, ideally they're going to come straight out of your accounting system. And you're going to review them and make sure they look okay before they go out the door, obviously, and make adjustments if needed. But if you are taking your system information and dumping it into Excel, it's just fraught with the opportunity for human error. I mean, whether it's intentional or not, it can happen. So to the extent you can just generate reports out of your system, that's going to be ideal. And most systems, you can modify the reporting to be whatever you want. In the back? What jurisdiction are you from, sir? Appreciate that. So he had two suggestions. One was to try to align, if you're the person reviewing checks, to try to align that with the expenditures that you're seeing. So for example, if I signed a $10,000 check in this last check run, and then the next month comes and I don't see that expenditure, it'd be a good way to ask a question. And his other suggestion was to, after you've prepared those reports, is to have someone else look at them before they get to the board. So if you have a designated person on the board, if you have another staff person, if you have a volunteer in the community who knows what they're doing, who could ask some questions, that might be ideal. Number 10 on the SDAO best practice checklist was all investment transactions are reviewed and approved by the board. If you're fortunate enough to have an investment account, it's likely in a county pool or the LGIP pool, and you could have other options. Maybe you are one of those districts who's lucky enough to actually have enough cash to invest in outside markets. If you are making those investments, obviously have an investment policy, and your board should be aware of that policy and should be monitoring the transactions according to that policy, the investment and the sales and the purchases. Number 11, is your financial audit conducted in accordance with Oregon audit law? So I want to call on some of my colleagues to provide input on this, but I think I'm in the same place where I was with the signatures, where if there's documentation in the board minutes that they are reviewing them and asking questions, and they've been presented that information and had the opportunity to ask questions, then that's your control. You've documented that the control exists. Having a formal resolution, again, I don't know the value that adds.
We don't do a resolution, just do a vote. Just do a motion.
Okay. Other thoughts?
That's pretty common.
Okay.
Our board, they don't approve them, they accept them.
Great.
After review.
Great. That's kind of the in-between of just an acknowledgement and move on. Good. Number 12, detailed property and equipment records are maintained that include description, date purchased, and cost. Yeah, Eric.
I was just going to say, do people know how they're getting an audit in accordance with
Do they know how they're getting an audit in accordance? Do they know whether they are? So that's part of any board member's responsibility. That's part of your fiduciary responsibility as a board member to make sure that your organization is being audited or reviewed, if you don't need an audit, that you're getting reviewed in accordance with state law. That's one of your responsibilities. If you don't know whether that's happening for some reason, or you're uncomfortable with staff's answer for any reason, you can contact the Secretary of State, their audits division, and you can also look online. All audits that have been completed are posted on that website, and you can pull them up. Does that answer your question?
No.
Oh, okay. Try again.
When you're requesting an audit in Oregon, the law requires that the audit be done by a licensed municipal auditor. That's a separate license than a CPA.
Is that true? Oregon budget law requires it to be a licensed municipal auditor?
Oregon audit law requires,
Okay,
and it has to be signed by a municipal auditor.
right. Okay, thank you.
That's how you know.
That's how you know, yeah. Good, thank you, Eric. That's helpful. Yes?
We do use a certified municipal auditor for Secretary of State.
Okay.
And I had heard that you should change auditors every 3 or 4 years or so, and we are extremely happy with our auditor, and they're certified, and so what I've heard is, although it's not required, it's a good idea. So can you speak to that?
Yes, I can. I'm sorry, what jurisdiction are you from?
Land, soil, and water conservation.
Great, thank you. So I have my professional opinion. Others will have their professional opinion. My opinion is that there is a lot of value. My experience is that there's a lot of value to having the same auditor looking at your books. Maybe not for 20 years, but at least for 5, 6, 7, probably 10 years. It takes a long time for an auditor to get to know your organization. And so they do a lot of work in that first year or two to get to know your organization. You guys have seen, the ones who've suffered through a first year audit have seen how much work it is. And they go to a lot of effort to understand your organization. But there are always quirks to every organization. And it takes a while to get to know those. And it takes a while to develop that relationship. So if you've been with the same auditor for 4 years, I personally would not be in a hurry to switch. Now, if the contract is up, then you may or may not have a choice of whether you do an RFP depending on your own procurement policies. That doesn't mean you have to change. Yeah. And if you've had the same auditor for 7, 8 years, then maybe it is worth doing an RFP. And the auditors in the room are going to hate me for saying that, but maybe it's worth doing an RFP, even if you could direct appoint someone or do some other kind of procedure. It's probably worth going through the process just to hold your auditor accountable on their fees and make sure that you're doing your due diligence. Did that answer your question, Jeanette? Great. Property and equipment records. Make sure that stuff's documented so you know and can prove when it walks away. Yes?
Is there a minimum cost of what you record? I mean, do you have to keep a record of staplers?
For accounting rules, like generally accepted accounting practices, you set a minimum threshold. No, don't track your staplers.
So best practice would be versus recommend?
Depends on the district. Absolutely not less than $500. Absolutely not less.
$250, I don't have to keep track.
I wouldn't unless it's a sensitive item, like a gun or a laptop that might walk off. You know, you might still track those things. Yeah. It's going to make your life really difficult. Generally speaking, smaller districts, I advise my clients to not have less than $1,000 as a threshold, $1,000. Yes.
I think there's a difference between capitalizing it and tracking. Sometimes people don't. So we don't capitalize under 5,000.
Okay.
We track for 1,000.
Right.
Two different processes.
Right. And what jurisdiction are you from?
Those are the
Thanks. So there is a difference between tracking your assets for operational purposes. You want to know where stuff is. Forget the audit, forget the financials. You want to know where stuff is. You're accountable for those items, right? And dollar amount may or may not apply. If it's a sensitive item like a gun or ammunition or something like that, you want to be tracking it. And maybe based on your management style or your board, maybe they want you to take the time to track that $250 item. But for accounting rules, you don't have to go to the same level. You can, instead of tracking whether or not it exists, for capitalization rules and accounting rules, you track it, but then you also have to calculate depreciation every year and track. Yeah, so it's a lot of work. So we're kind of talking about two different things. Is that clear as mud, pretty much? Okay. Physical inventory. So you're keeping that list. Go check it. Is your list still right? Are you missing anything on the list? Did something walk off? Do that annually. If you have a lot of assets and it's just too much to handle, maybe put it on a rotation plan where maybe this year you're going to go find all your equipment and next year you're going to go find all your buildings and vehicles. You know, chunk it out if you need to, but make sure you're touching it. Yeah, Eric.
I was gonna say, that's also a good time to evaluate the condition of the assets.
Nice.
It's one thing to have 50 feet of fire hose that's got holes in it.
Yeah, exactly. Could you guys hear that in the back? So Eric was mentioning that it's also a good opportunity to assess the condition of those assets. You know, maybe you have that fire hose, maybe you have that stapler, but it doesn't actually work, it's jammed. So what can you do about it and get that maintenance, get the higher level maintenance plan in place? Build it into your budget. Those were the 13 items. These are the links for the 2 videos that were on that list. They're pretty short and sweet, and we could watch them as part of the session, but I don't want to take the time now, so I'm going to revisit that. If we, for some reason, have time at the end of the session, we'll come back to that, and I'll offer to play those for you guys. And then the other piece, I don't have a slide for this, but then that 4th piece was the training that the SDAO, SDIS offers. So I want to make a suggestion to you guys as I was thinking about this, and I have a client that's doing this, and I love it, is they have worked in these best practices into their director's goals and performance evaluation. And it's a fantastic tracking mechanism, right? Because when you first get that checklist, you're going to go through it and you're going to be, wondering what you're missing, and it'll be clear. And it's such a good quantifiable document where you can say, this is what I've accomplished. This was my goal. Board set this as my goal, and I've accomplished this goal. Check mark. Bonus points, gold star for me. So something to consider. And if you don't like this list, I mean, even if you do like this list, take it and modify it for your organization. Moving on from those best practices. Any other thoughts? Okay, another resource. Woo, getting out of control. Hold on, go back. So just in looking at resources that you guys might be able to use, obviously you're welcome to call me anytime. You'll have my contact information or email me. And your auditor is a fantastic resource. This is just a quick and easy list, an article that I found from a colleague on suggested internal controls. And they focused on the disbursements process, and they just said, hey, you guys, here's some things you really should focus on as control process, right? Internal control process, and specific activities within that. So I want to go through this pretty quickly, but this is in your slideshow that you have access to online, and you can come back and look at it. 5 easy internal controls your government should implement. Should in air quotes. Disbursement controls. Reviewing sequencing of checks, we've already talked about. analyzing wire transactions and electronic payments. So don't forget about these, you guys. So we review checks and we look at the support, but don't forget about the electronic transactions. And there are different ways to create control activities around electronic transactions, but please don't forget about those. Yeah.
Small fire district,
Okay.
according to SDAO guidelines, the person who writes the check is not the person who reconciles the check.
Okay. Great.
You haven't said that up there, I thought that was the guideline that they set.
I didn't see that on the checklist that the best practices checklist that I reviewed. It very well could be, and it's a very good control to have if you have the bodies to separate it. And that review of the bank statement and the banking activity and doing the reconciliation is another key internal control. Having that be someone who's not involved, especially in the disbursement process, but preferably even on the cash receipting process, is pretty crucial. You can find a lot of suggestions through that reconciliation process. Thank you. Yes?
And also just making sure that that person who is doing the review understands and knows how to appropriately do the review.
Yes. Making sure that person knows what they're looking for and the questions that we're wanting them to ask. So the definition of a reconciliation, the way I define it, is you have two independent sources of information and you're trying to figure out how to tie the two together. So in this case, a bank reconciliation is comparing the bank statement versus your bank transactions in your accounting system. And it's identifying the difference. Just like you balance your checkbook, some people still balance their checkbooks, right, every month. Yes, no, I do not do that. I look at my transactions, but I don't actually balance my account. But anyway, it's true.
I do.
You do?
Every day, every month to the penny.
All right, well, you get a gold star. You don't either?
Review the disbursement.
Very good. Okay. See, I'm not alone.
Don't check them.
Hecklers, I hear you. I love it. So that's a reconciliation. Is that helpful? Some vendor controls. As you're reviewing expenditures, those of you that are doing the duplicate signature, take a look at those vendors. Make sure, again, does it make sense? Does it pass the gut check? Keep those vendor lists clean. If you have hundreds of vendors, a bunch of them that you don't use anymore, clean those up. They're just going to confuse matters and increase your risk. Review any records for duplicate payments. Again, that's your check when you're reviewing. Haven't I seen this before? Was there another one like this? Did I skip one? No. Payroll controls. I've seen, for me, I don't see a ton of fraud in what I do, but the fraud that I have seen, more of it has been in the payroll side, interestingly enough. And so there's a set of controls that you want to look at. Again, sequencing the checks and checking it on the back end. Generating exception reports. So a lot of systems these days can generate audit reports or exception reports, and it can kick out any activity, print you a list of the activity of unusual transactions. Take a look at that once a month, once a quarter. Someone who is not involved in the transaction should be reviewing that, and you can find some pretty interesting things on that list. Review the employee roster for duplicate employees. Pretty obvious again. Or ghost employees. Yeah. Who is that Jack guy? I haven't seen him around. I don't know where Jack came from, you guys. Seriously, do I even know a Jack? I don't know any Jacks. Purchasing controls. Ensure purchases above the defined threshold require approval. Again, that's another example of a control activity. If you have P cards or credit cards, make sure they have a limit that's appropriate and continue to review that. That limit may need to change depending on the staffing and the situation. Periodically review purchases for unusual activity. Again, that's going to come in your bank reconciliation. It's going to come in reviewing your invoices. Make sure there's supporting documentation and separate separate your purchasing and approval functions. So whoever, again, ideally, if we have a lot of staff, we can have someone doing the purchasing and someone else doing the receiving and someone else processing invoices, and we're going to talk about that. I keep saying we're going to talk about that. I promise we will. Yes, Eric.
I was gonna say you're splitting transactions or purchases
Mhm.
to stay underneath the limit by Oregon purchasing law.
Right. Oregon purchasing law, or your district may have more conservative limits. Yeah. Exactly. Yep. Did you guys hear that? As you're reviewing separate transactions on the purchasing side, making sure that you're staying within your purchasing limits. There are purchasing requirements, contracting requirements through the state. I think we all know that, but keeping track of those. And your district may have more conservative rules than the state, right? So the state sets a bar, and each district can adopt rules that are stricter than the state's rules. So make sure you know your own district's policies. General accounting controls. So this is another big one for me, is establishing the journal entry review and approval process. Journal entries are outside of normal day-to-day transaction processing. They are usually one-off. They are outside of normal process. So many times if there is fraud going on, or if there are errors or weaknesses in a process, you're going to see journal entries to try to fix it or try to hide it or whatever the situation is. Journal entries, your general journal entries, are a good way to, it's a good internal control to have, to take a look at those and review those. Again, by someone who's not involved in the process, ideally. Implement system controls when practical. It's looking at your system, what can it do, what can it not do, and what controls do you need to put in place to supplement any weaknesses it might have. So that is just an article, again, put out by a colleague that has some more suggestions. As you guys are all going back to your district and analyzing your strengths and weaknesses, these may give you some suggestions. How are we doing on time? 35 minutes left? Oh my. I have a lot more material here, folks, so we will figure out how to cut what we need to. Okay. We're here. This is it. We can finally have the conversation. So we keep talking about segregation of duties. How many, again, did we have, how many offices did we have that had 5 or fewer staff members? Yeah, look around. It's a lot of you guys. And with segregation of duties being so important, I get that question all the time. Like, what am I supposed to do? We only have so many people doing these functions. What am I supposed to do? And there is no solid answer. There's no bullet that's just going to answer this question for you. What you do is you do the best you can, right? You do your due diligence. You explore all your options. You get creative. You ask everyone you can think of. And at the end of the day, if you still can't find something that works, then you just do the best you can. So I also want to ask the question, for those of you getting audits or reviews, maybe not reviews, maybe it's just audits, how many of you guys, if you know, do not have a significant deficiency or material weakness on your audit related to segregation of duties? You guys do not have it? Do not. So I primarily work with small clients, and I know of only one of my clients does not have that comment in their audit from their auditors about segregation of duties. And it's basically just saying, you know, we understand the organization's small, but we just need to acknowledge that there's a risk here that because you don't have enough people, that something could go awry. So it's just an acknowledgement. The one client who does not have that finding or that comment has contracted with an outside party to do their bank reconciliations, to look at their financial statements monthly or quarterly, and to provide other support and advice during the year. And my understanding from the auditor is that's the main reason why they don't have that finding. Otherwise, they probably would.
We always used to have that finding. We're a small district, and the last 3 years ago, we hired an outside bookkeeper to do our payroll and our monthly accounting reconciliation.
Payroll and monthly bank reconciliation? And who did you hire to do that?
A local CPA firm.
Awesome. Is it crazy expensive?
We pay $600 a month.
Is it worth it?
Yeah.
What?
And now we don't get that on our audit every year. We used to have more internal control.
Good. Okay. Thank you for sharing. Other ideas, creative ideas? And I guess I wanted to say, so I was having this conversation with some people last night about this topic, and it's on all of our minds. And the comment that they made was actually awesome. It was, what am I supposed to do? I only have so many people in the office. Am I just supposed to go grab someone off the street and drag them in here and have them review? And, I kind of laughed about it at the time, but maybe. I mean, not just random stranger, but someone that you've vetted, someone that's willing to spend an hour at City Hall a week that has some kind of financial background. Maybe you can find someone in your community who's willing to provide that role. Maybe. Just, again, it's all about getting creative. The people that you do have, if you can't segregate duties, your people are the key. You got to get the good ones. You got to at least do your best to try to find the good ones. Do that pre-employment screening. I know it costs some money. Totally worth it. Do it. Because even the most trusted employees can justify their actions. So do the best you can when you're hiring these folks. And keep a lookout. Keep a lookout for these folks. Stay in touch with them. You don't have to dive into their personal life, but if someone starts coming in with a bunch of bling on their hand, or they're driving a brand new car or something like that, if something doesn't make sense, it's a little red flag. Follow your gut on that stuff. Try to follow up on it. Ask some questions. To the extent you can, cross-train and mandatory vacations. That's a big one. You have that person that's been there for 20 years and you trust them implicitly and they never take a vacation, right? And then something happens and they're sick and they're out for a week and you're like, oh my gosh, what is going on here? So mandatory vacations, do what you have to do, especially if you have that one person or two people, to make sure they're taking a vacation and getting a break and someone else can fill in for them. And this is the COSO framework, which we are not going to dive into, but know that that tool is out there. It covers your control environment, which is that tone at the top. That's the tone of integrity and accountability that's coming from the board and from upper management. You go through a risk assessment to analyze the risks to your organization. And then based on those risks, you identify control activities that will try to mitigate those risks. When you're looking at that risk assessment, always keep in mind, and this is another kind of tone I want, an important message to get across, is a control activity may sound like a good idea, but make sure you're thinking about the risk that it's trying to address, and make sure that that risk is a high impact risk. Like if this should happen, is it really a big deal? Is it not a big deal? If it's a big deal, make sure you've got something covering it. If not, then maybe you're all right. Information and communication is about how you're getting information from your system and other sources, and then how you're communicating back out. Is that done with integrity? How do you know that that information is reliable? And then monitoring on the back end. So monitoring has a couple different dimensions, and that's again where the board is going to come back in. A lot of the middle stuff, the risk assessment and the actual activities within a process, are going to be at the staff level. We'll talk about that a little bit. But setting the tone and then monitoring on the back end, those are key. The monitoring on the back end I see as having two main components. One is following up with your management about the internal controls that are in place. Set a time once a year, whether it's part of their performance evaluation or outside of that. Maybe it's the time you get your audit results. I don't know, time it, but work it into a schedule where the board is asking management direct questions. Do we have internal controls in place? Are we doing bank reconciliations? Are they being done timely? Asking those questions directly, again, sets that tone. It comes back full circle, sets that tone of accountability. And the other piece to monitoring is actually looking at the financial reports and asking questions, participating in the budget cycle, but more importantly, looking at that budget compared to the actuals on the back side. A lot of times when you have segregation of duties issues, the monitoring on the back end can be kind of the fail-safe on the back end. Maybe I can't do this control activity because I don't have enough people, right? I can't do it at the time. I can't review this transaction. There's no one to review it. But at the very least on the back end, someone's looking at that expenditure account to make sure it looks reasonable. That's COSO, burning through. Do 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 do. Do 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 do. That's my really terrible elevator music. What does it look like? There is a handout. It's not an actual, I don't know why they call it handouts because we're not actually handing anything out, but it's another attachment that's available online. It's a picture of what this analysis might look like if you were wanting to do it for your organization. It's just kind of a quick sample. Role of the board in internal controls. How are we doing on time? 20 minutes, okay. Role of the board. So I just kind of gave you a quick and dirty on this, but I have my whiteboard here. This is how I tend to visualize board role versus staff role. It is really important to keep the board and staff delineation for a whole lot of reasons. But from an internal control standpoint, it's about, again, about maintaining that accountability. When you start confusing the roles, mishmashing the roles, you lose the tone, you lose the monitoring capacity, and you create confusion, basically. And again, that happens in more than just the finance world, but we're kind of talking about the COSO framework and the internal control activities versus the whole process. I see the board setting the tone of the organization, again, by holding folks accountable and by having integrity yourself and being transparent yourself and being genuine yourself. All these things, your decision making and how you're communicating, all of those things create the culture of your organization. It pushes down, it impacts your frontline managers and trickles down to staff. So you've got your tone coming from the board that's going to be impacting your staff, if you have staff. So for the most part, you've got your tone, it's setting objectives for the organization, it's setting strategic goals. Your board, you want to stay at a higher level as much as possible. You want them setting policies. You want them setting goals for the organization. You want them communicating to outside parties to some extent. Ideally, you don't want them involved in the day-to-day activity, right? Just keeping that delineation. I think that's ideal for everyone. But in smaller local governments, there are those times where you do want to call in the board. You don't have anybody else to participate to do this review. So you're setting the tone for the staff, and then there are all these activities that you're trying to do. There may be some where you need to reach back up to the board and have them do that, but keep it to one person if possible, not the entire board. If you are wanting someone to review your expenditures, have one person from the board delegated to do that process for you. Don't necessarily need to send the list of expenditures to the board every month and have the entire board approve and sign off on it. Just having one person could do that, especially if that person's actually looking at it and asking questions. That's key. You have to look at the information and ask the questions. So all of the activities, for the most part, are happening at the staff level. You may have a board person flying in to help with certain places where you have a risk. But the board is then also going to be looking on the back end with the monitoring. So that's where they're asking the direct questions of the staff, right? Do you have this stuff in place? And you're looking at the reports that are kicking out on the back end of this process to see if anything's going awry. Thank you for letting me draw a picture. I can't believe I only used one color. I know, I'm disappointed in myself. You should write that on the evaluation. Okay. Yikes. If that's the worst comment I get, then that's fine. Questions, thoughts about role of the board versus management. These slides basically just communicate what I drew in my beautiful picture. I wanted to make the point again about the financials because I see so many of my clients in other organizations not doing that monitoring side. The board gets the financial information, and a lot of times it's, I'm not a financial person. They just sort of glaze over. They're not understanding, and so they check out. So staff and other board members, please know how important that is, both for the tone. Reviewing and asking questions, that's management saying, oh, wow, they're really paying attention. I better make sure this is good. So it is very important, and take the time to train them, to help them understand what they're looking at and keep it simple. Yes, in the back?
I think it's the best way, the most effective way to train your board in that respect.
I would schedule a separate work session. Obviously, I think that's obvious. Outside of a full public meeting, and it can still be a public process. There's no reason it can't be. But I would just start with the basics of, here's the process. I would walk them through the process, and then I would show them how it plays out and is reflected in this information that they get. And another key of that is keeping that information that they receive simple, summarized. Create pictures if you can. I like the idea of a financial dashboard. If you're doing something like that, or if you're not and are interested, look it up. There's whole classes about financial dashboards and communicating with your board. But I think that's what I would do, is I would take the time to communicate, here's the process that we go through, and then here's how it ends up showing up in this document, and here's what this document means. And taking the time to do that is going to win you gold stars with the board too, because you're going to be able to communicate in their language, hopefully, and you're going to be transparent, you're going to be yourself, and it's going to build that confidence. They're going to understand what they're looking at. They're going to understand where you're coming from a lot better. A couple more internal control failures, and Kay may be able to help with this as well. Don't focus where the risk is low. Make sure that if you're taking the time to do these internal controls, we're busy. There's so much to do. If you're going to do this internal control, make sure it's got impact. Make sure it's worth it. Stuff's going to come up during the year. You're going to have people changing places, changing turnover for staff. You're going to have different banking arrangements. Circumstances change, and make sure you're readdressing your risks when those things happen. Talk to your auditors. Again, amazing resource. And that's really, in my opinion, the true value of an audit. Yes, they are an accountability and it's a requirement, but use them. Use those recommendations that they give you. That's the true value, I believe, for a district, are those recommendations and suggestions from your audit. Make sure to tailor borrowed policies. I think this is just something that we've seen, right? Where you're getting a policy as a template and then not tailoring it, and it doesn't really make sense. If it doesn't make sense, then it's not very helpful. And then remember, don't forget to address your budget controls and your granting and your IT. Look at that system and make sure you know what its strengths and weaknesses are. So Kay, do you want to share some of your other internal control fails, if we have time?
Sure. I do think that there's always an ability to have segregation of duties. Maybe not as much as there would be if you have 200 people, but you can take advantage of your board members, your budget committee members, and even outside consultants that can help you segregate those duties. So always make sure that the person that's going to sign your check is not the one that's creating the check. Obviously, that's a good one. Somebody that's can oversee your payroll. Payroll is actually probably maybe one of the number one ways that people do commit fraud. And that's something that's overlooked. People always tend to focus on the checks, and that does happen as well. But I think payroll is also another one that can be very open to fraud.
And with payroll, it's not just the fake employee and not just your wage, but it's also on the deduction side.
Mhm.
People are playing some fun games with deductions.
Yes, Sisters Camp Sherman actually had an unusual, and I don't think it had anything to do with fraud. It was just a mistake. So I really highly recommend that the districts don't do their own payroll. I really try to focus to use ADP, use Paychecks, use Precisely Payroll. Somebody that's all they do for a living, because taxes and payroll is extremely complicated. So even I've been doing it for years, and I don't like to do it. So I like to have somebody that's a separate person that's keeping control of this, do payroll. And then I also have another person that will even sign off on the payroll report once it's done. So even I may be inputting the payroll to whoever my Paychecks or ADP or something, but then that report that comes back gets signed by somebody else. So there's ways to do it. You can have a board member that's responsible for making sure that they can look online and see your bank statements. Just things like that. I think there's always ways to have a segregation of duties. And I was also going to say, if you don't have to have an audit, which I don't think a lot of small ones necessarily have to have an audit because it is very expensive, do a review, which means have somebody in your community that looks at the books, that goes back through, and that it just is it's a way to say, I'm open. I didn't mean to make any mistakes. I may have, but please look it over and make sure. So
And
I
that's
always,
for the organizations that don't fall within the audit threshold.
Yes.
And don't fall within the review threshold.
Right.
You're so small that all you have to do is submit the form to the
Yeah.
Secretary of State. And your suggestion is have another person
Right.
look at it.
So that's when when you get the Girl Scouts or the sports teams. That's usually what you have is one person that's been in control of it forever. They've never had anybody look at it. That is where I think that as a board member, that's where you really have to take control and say, I want somebody else looking at it, and then you sign off that somebody else looked at it. Don't let that person make the arrangements and then it's all done. There has to be communication with the board. So it has to be outside people looking at it. So that's what I would say is I believe that there's always an ability to make segregation of duties somewhat.
Thank you.
I wouldn't want to make one other thing. We did have Sisters Camp Sherman had an interesting thing happen years ago, way before I was here. And it actually did involve a board member, a former sheriff actually, who was able to steal about $500,000. And it happened over a number of years. But the things that people can do outside of what you think are controls is amazing, even from people that you think that you can trust. People that he was sheriff of the year for the year 2000. So I think that you really have to be careful, not just in the staff people, but if board members are in charge of checks or just there has to be more coverage than just one or two, and they can be very sneaky. So
That's another good point. Thank you. So if there are no other questions, oh, there's one in the back, just under the wire. Trust but verify. Very nice. Resources available. Other resources that we've talked about, you'll find these in your slides. And use each other, right? Use each other. These are some of the sources that we used for the presentation. And I'm going to get sappy for a minute. You guys that know me know I tend to do this, but This is a saying that I send to my mother every week or two because I truly believe in it, and I want to share it with you. And I guess I want to let you guys know that I see all the work that you do, and I see your dedication to your communities, and thank you. Honestly, truly, thank you for your service to the organization and to your communities. And that's it. Enjoy Sun River.